Hello, this brief webinar is titled Human Arrogance, Human Tragedy, and is a part of the 10-part series on the 100-year anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. Well, there's been, again, books that have been written on this topic, but to summarize the folly of Titanic in its heyday and the hubris in which it was operated: not enough lifeboats on the boat, no binoculars for lookouts, steaming faster and faster in order to set a record on the maiden voyage, the ignoring of iceberg warnings, and the idea and concept that God can't even sink this ship was the hubris and arrogance that led to Titanic's demise. And what I want to do here is just focus briefly on the emotional impact of that tragedy, because it's significant, and just paint a couple of the scenes. This is what the book says. There were some terrible scenes. Fathers were parting from their children and giving them an encouraging pat on the shoulders. Men were kissing their wives and telling them what they would be with them shortly. There's a father that turned over his 2 children as a final act of sacrifice. On that fateful night of the Titanic disaster, and just as the last boats were pulling away with their human freight, a man rushed to the rail holding the babes under his arms. He cried to the passengers in one of the boats and held the children aloft. 3 or 4 sailors and passengers held up their arms. The father dropped the older boy, and he was safely caught. Then he dropped the little fellow and saw him folded into the arms of a sailor. Then the boat pulled away. The last scene of the father, whose last living act was to save his sons, he was waving his hand in a final parting. Then the Titanic plunged to the ocean's bed. There were 12 newly married couples on Titanic. There were, I understand, 12 newly married couples aboard the big ship. The 12 brides had been saved, but of the husbands all but one have perished. That one would not have been here had he not been urged to assist in manning a lifeboat. Think of the self-sacrifice of these 11 heroes who stood on the doomed vessel and parted from their brides forever, knowing full well that a few brief minutes would end all things for themselves. The bodies of the Fred and Augusta and Goodwin and their 5 eldest children were never found, an entire family lost. The scene in the water after April 15th was described as thus: "It was between 4 and 5 o'clock Saturday, April 20th, she said, when our ship sighted an iceberg off the bow to the starboard. As we drew nearer and could make out small dots floating around in the sea, a feeling of awe and sadness crept over everyone on the ship. We passed within 100 feet of the southernmost drift of the wreckage, and looking down over the rail we distinctly saw a number of bodies so clearly that we could make out what they were wearing and whether they were men or women. We saw one woman in her nightdress with a baby clasped closely to her breast. Several women passengers screamed and left the rail in a fainting condition. There was another woman fully dressed with her arms tied around the body of a shaggy dog. The bodies of 3 men in a group, all clinging to one steamship chair, floated nearby, and just beyond them were a dozen bodies of men, all of them encased in life-preservers, clinging together as though in a last desperate struggle for life. We couldn't see, but imagined that under them was some bit of wreckage to which they all clung when the ship went down, and which didn't have buoyancy enough to support them." A few questions for consideration. Human hubris, or pride, and arrogance can lead to tragedy. Where do you see that in our culture today? Where does pride come from? Where does humility come from? What will you do to be a better servant to others and to those you lead? Here are some additional resources you can find online from our partners in this series. This Worldview Training channel, of course, biblicalworldviewtraining.org, ipriority.com, and the 21-Day Faith Experiment might help you answer these deeper questions of life. My name's Craig Seibert. Thanks for listening.